In a small American village nestled near the edge of a dense forest, there lived a woman named Barbara. The locals considered her a bit of an oddity, perhaps touched in the head. She kept to herself, wasn't much to look at, and her age was a mystery to all. Her skin was smooth and unwrinkled, but her eyes held a weariness as if she was thoroughly bored with the world. Barbara rarely made eye contact with anyone, too withdrawn to even communicate through glances. What puzzled everyone the most was that no one could recall how or when she arrived in the village. After the war, everything got mixed up. Many left, searching for a new start, while strangers arrived, some staying for good. It seemed Barbara might have been one of those wanderers looking for a better fate. She took up residence in the most dilapidated and tiny house at the forest's edge, which over the years she let fall into complete disrepair. Occasionally, a kindly neighbor would fix her roof, only to mutter under his breath about the lack of gratitude. The rainwater would stop dripping into the bucket she placed under the leaks, and yet Barbara couldn't even muster a thank you or meet his gaze. No one knew how she survived, what she ate. She was always seen in the same simple dress, now heavy with the dirt that clung to its hem. The same dress, yet she didn't smell of the human musk that clings to the unwashed body, but rather of damp earth and mildew. Then, one night in the early 90s, after too much whiskey, one of the local boys broke into her home. Maybe someone dared him, or perhaps his desire for any kind of female companionship was so strong that it didn't matter who it was. It was a quiet, clear, full moon night, rich with the scents of blooming flowers and the chirping of crickets. The whole town had been celebrating Memorial Day earlier, with live music, the scent of pies filling the air, and plenty of eating, drinking, and merrymaking. The young man, named Ted, was in his mid-20s. Bursting into Barbara's house, Ted immediately felt uneasy. The place reeked of emptiness and decay, a stark contrast to the lived-in smell of his Uncle Steve's place, despite the old man's penchant for drinking his days away. Uncle Steve's house smelled of a warm stove, sweat, unwashed feet, sour milk, and a rotting mop. Disgusting, yet alive in its own way. Barbara's house, however, smelled as if it hadn't seen a visitor in decades, with the musty scent of a damp basement, dusty curtains, and mold. Ted felt an urge to turn around and flee, but convinced himself that running away would be cowardly. So he pressed on, feeling his way in the darkness as the windows were draped with some fabric blocking the moonlight. He stumbled upon a door, pushing it open with a quiet creak. As he entered, not quite accustomed to the darkness, he brushed his head against the low door frame. Barbara was short, and the doors in her house were made to match. In the pitch black, Ted lost his sense of direction until suddenly he heard a faint movement in the corner. The primal fear that darkness and the unknown instills in most people suddenly awakened a warrior spirit in him. With a shout, he lunged forward. "Leave," came Barbara's voice, soft and hoarse, unfamiliar to Ted's ears. It was widely believed that the eccentric from the outskirts had been mute since the war, never recovering her voice. She reached for the window, pulling back the curtain, and in the pale moonlight, Ted saw her face for the first time, calm, unattractive, almost lifeless. "What the—" Ted tried to sound confident, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. Frustrated with himself, he lashed out at Barbara, punching at her expressionless face. "Let's get this over with," he blurted out, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. She didn't resist, and her tranquility somehow gave him strength. She must be desperate for it, probably hasn't had a man in over 20 years, he thought. Barbara was wrapped in layers of fabric, like a shroud. Ted managed to unbutton his wool jacket, only to find more cloth underneath, and then something silky and cool to the touch. Angered, he tore at the fabric, which disintegrated into dust in his hands. Barbara lay still, her arms straight by her sides as if prepared for burial. Her eyes were open, and Ted nodded absently that they lacked any sheen, like those of a doll. The rage within him was a volcanic fire, eager to erupt, and at that moment, it mattered little to him whether his release came from a living woman, his own clenched fist, or this pallid effigy. Her chest was as deflated as the nutsacks his mother used to store in the pantry, devoid of any fullness or the softness of milk, while her nipples felt like coarse, dark fungi, uninviting to the touch. In that moment, Ted's mind felt split in two. One part couldn't fathom desiring this withered, waxen body. It was horrifying, repulsive. Yet another part, as if enchanted, simply surrendered to a blind compulsion, a surge of passion. He pushed her legs apart with his knee. They were as cool and gray as wax, and with a single thrust, he entered her. To the part of Ted that felt fear and disgust, it seemed his flesh wasn't joining with a woman, but plunging into a jar of cold buttermilk. Inside Barbara, it was loose, cold, and damp. After Ted left, his pants tangled around his legs, feeling as though he had been laboring all day in the forest, though he chalked up his weakness and dizziness to the whiskey. He made his way home and fell into bed without undressing. He was tormented by nightmares all night. He dreamt he was walking through a village cemetery, with earth-stained hands reaching out from the graves, trying to grab his pant legs, their fingers icy and rigid. A buzzing in his ears, the lifeless voices pleaded, come to me, please, come to me." Then a girl appeared on the path before him, standing with her back to him, petite, with long wheat-blonde hair flowing over her shoulders, dressed in a wedding gown. Ted rushed towards her as if she were a saving deity, but then she slowly turned around, and it was clear she too was dead. Her pale face marred by greenish blotches, her once plump upper lip half rotted away, revealing teeth, her eyes lacking any sparkle. Come to me, she droned. "Approach. They buried me in this wedding dress on purpose. I was waiting for you." Ted woke up as his mother splashed icy water in his face from a ladle. "Have you lost your mind, drunkard? You drank yourself to the devil and screamed all night as if I have nerves of steel." Weeks passed. Initially, Ted couldn't shake off a sense of despondency, as if heavy wings had spread over him, blocking out the sunlight. His appetite vanished, along with any desire to laugh, work, or breathe. But gradually, he managed to pull himself together, came to his senses, started to ask his mother for pancakes in the morning again, and cast glances at the village's most beautiful girl, Julie, with her long, thick braids and devilish sparkle in her eyes. He avoided Barbara, though that was easy. She seldom left her home and garden, and when she did venture out to the village street, she stuck to the edge and looked at her own dusty shoes, not at the people she passed. Gradually, the bizarre night began to fade from memory, and Ted wasn't entirely sure of its reality anymore. His mind had formed a snowball from actual facts and the subsequent nightmares, making it difficult to discern what was true and what was a terrifying figment created by his inner darkness. Winter arrived. During the winter evenings, Ted often turned to woodworking, a craft taught to him by his father, and both possessed skilled hands. People from all around sought his services. Someone needed a dining table made, another a fence repaired, and someone else a deck built onto their house. Then, in late November, something odd happened. There was a persistent knock at the door, as if urgent business was at hand. But when Ted opened it, there was no one in sight. The person who had disturbed the evening's peace seemed to have been swallowed by the icy, sleet-filled space outside. Only on the doorstep, weighed down by a whetstone, lay an envelope. Glancing around, Ted picked it up, peeked inside, and was even more surprised to find money. Not millions, but a substantial amount, precisely what he would ask for to build a summer deck. For a small town, this was extraordinary. The neighbors, of course, weren't starving, but saving money was hard, and people preferred to pay in installments for work done. Along with the bills, a note fell from the envelope. "Please make a coffin, 1 meter in length, oak or pine. Take the money now, and I will come for the finished work at my earliest convenience." Ted was neither timid nor superstitious, but something chilled him as he finished reading. A 1-meter length meant a child's coffin. Why would someone pay so much for it? If the customer had asked for a price, Ted would have quoted something 20 times less and not felt shortchanged. Why choose such an odd way to place an order? Was the grief so profound that it made facing others unbearable? But it seemed he had no choice but to keep the money. To whom could he return it? He could, of course, keep it in the envelope and hand it back when the customer showed up. But what if a child was on the brink of death? And then the person arrives, and nothing is ready. Should he bury the child in a towel? Ted felt heavy-hearted, but he completed the work. In 2 evenings, he was done. He chose the finest boards, working as if he were crafting a chest for imperial treasures. He even adorned the lid with carvings. After all, there was little else to do on winter evenings. A week passed, then another, and then a third began. But no one came for the work. The small coffin stood in the already cramped entryway, unnerving everyone. As he passed it, Ted's father would grimly mutter, "Damn!" And his mother, after tripping over it once, kicked the wooden box out of reflex, then sat down on the step and sobbed briefly. Then, on a New Year's Eve, Ted found himself alone at home. His parents and little sister had gone to visit relatives in the next town over, planning to stay the night. The evening was dark and blustery, the snowfall so thick neither land nor sky could be seen. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, that same insistent, hurried knock. Ted recognized it immediately, and his heart sank as if he were plummeting down an endless icy slope. Approaching the door cautiously, he asked who was there but received no reply. Somewhat superstitiously, he crossed himself before opening the door. There stood a short woman wrapped in a thick coat and large woolen scarf. It took Ted a moment to recognize her as Barbara. When he made out her emotionless gray face, he recoiled. "What do you want? Why are you here?" Ted tried to draw strength from his deliberate harshness. "It's time," she replied softly, stepping past him into the house. "I thought I had a few more weeks, but now I see I don't. It's time." "What are you babbling about, you fool? Go back where you came from." Then Barbara looked up at him. Ted stepped back, his gaze helplessly sweeping the entryway until it landed on the small axe they used for chopping kindling. "This is madness. I'm not going to attack her, a weak old woman with an axe. I could overpower her with my finger. What can she possibly do to me, the poor thing?" But the woman simply looked at him calmly, her eyes like puddles covered with ice, just as dull and doll-like as the night he had been trying to forget all these months. Barbara gave a smile, still devoid of any emotion. "What's the matter, Ted? Thought you could have your fun without any consequences? Bring water and rags. I'm about to give birth." "What the hell?" It was only then that he noticed her coat hanging open, revealing a huge, round belly beneath. "It's going to start any minute now. Why are you dawdling?" She didn't seem like a woman concerned about the arrival of her firstborn. Her face was bloodless and calm, her lips chapped, her voice steady and quiet. "I paid, after all. Fair and square. Did you do what I asked? In time?" Ted didn't immediately grasp what she was referring to, but when he did, he suddenly felt small and vulnerable. It was like those times when his father used to scare him with tales of wood goblins and bathhouse spirits, and Ted would spend all night trying to calm his breath, imagining rustles and knocks, a different, hidden life that began in the house when everyone went to sleep. He wanted to run to his mother, to breathe in her comforting warmth, but shame held him back. "Why do you need a coffin?" He almost whispered the last word into Barbara's face. "Well," she smiled, "he needs somewhere to sleep, doesn't he? It's going to be born dead," she said, caressing her tight belly. Ted felt dizzy. "Get the water," Barbara commanded, "and bring the rags. It's starting." He moved as if in a dream to the stove, grabbed the kettle, then rummaged in his mother's chest for some old sheets. Everything felt like a foolish prank. He couldn't believe that the village fool was truly about to give birth in his entryway, that he would have to assist in this. And then there were the damn money and the coffin. It's going to be born dead. When Ted returned to the entryway, Barbara was already lying on the floor, her skirts hiked up, her bloodless legs spread wide, her back arched as though she had been struck by lightning. Yet her face remained devoid of fear, pain, or anticipation. Ted's sister had also been born at home. The labor had come on suddenly in winter too, and they wouldn't have made it to the rural hospital in time. He remembered his mother's flushed, sweaty face, her primal scream more akin to an animal's growl, the way her hair, damp with sweat, scattered across the pillow, and the smell that filled the room, hot, thick, visceral. And he felt uneasy too, but it was a different kind of fear, a fear of witnessing some eternal, immutable truth. His mother had asked for sips of water, for handfuls of snow to be pressed to her forehead, for the window to be cracked open then shut. And then he heard his sister's muffled cry, and he and his father had a drink, rejoicing, and his mother looked so happy despite all the blankets soaked with her blood. Barbara, on the other hand, silently clenched her teeth as she brought new life into the world, working her hips and back, agile as a snake. And the entryway filled with a foreign smell of peat bog, decay, damp wood roots, earthworms. Suddenly, it was as if a faucet had been opened. Her waters broke, greenish-brown like stagnant pond water. Ted had to jump back. The foul-smelling fluid was so abundant it flooded the entire floor of the entryway. He didn't immediately notice that from this mire emerged a tiny creature, an infant as gray and lifeless as its mother. Barbara sat up, wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, and picked up the newborn from the floor. It weakly moved its arms. Its eyes were open, seemingly covered by a filmy sheen. Ted looked away. There was something unsettling about the child, something off. It didn't cry, but was already turning its head, clearly trying to take in its surroundings. "Stop standing around!" Barbara called out grimly. "You need to cut the umbilical cord. Haven't you read any books?" "I don't know how," Ted mumbled, nearly passing out from exhaustion and revulsion. "What's there to know? There's an axe right there. Just chop it with that." "Are you out of your mind?" "With an axe? I'm going to call Mrs. Olivia's. She knows how to do this." Ted thought suddenly, believing he had found a way out. "There's no need to call anyone." Barbara stopped him. "You're responsible. You'll have to answer for it. Bring the axe. I'll show you. And bring the coffin. He wants to sleep, see? Barbara, why does he need a coffin? What are you saying such dreadful things for?" Ted couldn't hold back any longer. "Where is it seen that a child sleeps in a coffin? You said it would be born deed, but look, it's moving. I'm as deed as he is." Barbara's lips stretched into something that was far from a smile. "Haven't you realized? Bring the coffin, and you need to rest too, because he'll be hungry soon. When you wake up, I'll teach you how to feed the dead." The last thing Ted saw before darkness enveloped him like a velvet wing was the old cracked ceiling. When his family returned the next morning, his body was already cold, but his eyes remained open, reflecting a look of mistrustful sorrow. No one could understand what had happened, but the entire floor of the entryway was covered in thick swamp water, which Ted's father couldn't manage to fully clear out in a day. And even after he did, the smell remained of decay, mold, and rot, lingering for many years, occasionally seeming to fade, but inevitably returning with the onset of each winter. As for Barbara, she was never seen in the village again. Yet for many years after, there were whispers that sometimes from her abandoned house, the dull, monotonous cry of an infant could be heard. Subscribe to our channel. Don't miss new and very scary stories.